Hey folks, it's Parker with Act Your Page, and I'm here with I'm here again with author Pete Blatchford. What are we going to talk about tonight, Pete?
We're going to talk about Big White Fog, a production in Chicago, produced under the auspices of the Federal Theatre Project. A first of a kind national arts project that was short-lived, but it produced quite a lot of content. It was among several artist programs of the period, and that extended to the visual arts, and dance, and writing, and a lot of important 20th century artists came out of that movement. It lasted from about 1936 to about 1938, but I'm here to sort of be a cheerleader for it, because I certainly didn't know about it when I first learned about it, and I certainly didn't know about the role that Chicago had played in terms of Chicago theater community. It was really the first time that Chicago theater artists were given a voice, their own voice. We think today of Chicago and it's kind of gritty realism, no holds barred dramas. That kind of began back in the 1930s under the auspices of the Federal Theatre Project. It was a program that, for the first time, really sort of allowed artists to be artists.
And I'll scroll ahead in the slideshow to the Federal Theatre Project, and then we'll back up a little bit.
Sure.
But you've said, it's Roosevelt, right? Part of the New Deal and the Civil Conservation Corps, and the country's in a deep depression, and we have major soil conservation issues and migration, and it's grapes of wrath. But he creates this Works Project Administration, which the Federal Theatre Project falls under, the FTP, and it's 1935. So we're deep in the Depression.
Mm-hmm.
The Works Project Administration, though, some people might be more familiar with it in what it did in terms of infrastructure, projects of infrastructure, or physical repair, built bridges, etc., things like that.
Mm-hmm.
But somebody has the vision and the clarity, multiple people, to say, hey, look, there's a lot of people in the arts out of the work. And that's a labor, that's a labor classification, and they should be paid. What a concept.
Mm-hmm.
So the Federal Theatre Project gets kicked off in 1935 to employ, as it turns out, thousands of grips and writers and actors and stagehands. Amazing vision, and so needed. But of course, like you say, it lasts about 4 years.
Right. It was by the time World War II came around, it was pretty much over. Though, if you live in an area, where you have like a post office that dates from about 1938 or 1940, you may walk into it and see these magnificent murals and possibly a sculpture adorning the outside, but inside you may see these murals, and those are all from that period. I know we've got one in our local post office, which was built about 1940. So there are still little remnants of it around.
Absolutely right. The murals are quite beautiful to see. So going back then to we'll go back to our first slide. You mentioned, and we should reference that today it was the first day that Big White Fog was staged.
Hmm.
So February 18th, 1938. And so you had approached me about talking about it now, right on the anniversary. And I think one of the first things you said was you paint a really good uh, picture of what it would have been like to have been a Black artist working in the theater at that time. Um, there certainly was talent, right? There were certainly uh, great poets and writers and painters and actors, but they really weren't getting much stage time, were they? Or much good stage time.
No, their productions had been relegated largely to college and community productions. Um, and that was largely because of the perception of African Americans. They were relegated when they did two productions. Those productions were written for them, and oftentimes they were included stereotypes, caricatures of bumbling, step and fetch it type characters, or housekeepers who were easily frightened, and not all you can imagine those stereotypes. However, the Federal Theatre Project allowed for the very first time for these very talented people um, to find their own voice for once.
Mm-hmm.
They were largely sort of, when they did do productions, they were largely relegated to the minstrel show or a
That's right.
musical or some such.
Or a maid, right? We look at the films of the era of the 1930s, and the presence of African Americans is right. Hattie McDaniel, Butterfly McQueen.
Mhm.
The minstrel shows we talked about a little bit, and you mentioned, I mean, I think people are familiar with this idea, but what we're talking about are white or Caucasians putting on blackface to pretend as though they are African American. And this ties in with one of the quotes Pete mentions about the hubris of one theater producer who said, we know black people and black culture better than they know themselves, and that's why we get to produce the shows we do.
Mhm.
So this is in the era. It's wildly popular, not just in the 19th, but in the 20th century, the minstrel shows.
Mhm.
In fact, this is actually taken from a British television series that ran into the 70s.
Wow.
Um, so interesting context. And along comes the Federal Theatre Project, and it doesn't exactly simulate what's going on what was going on in theater prior to the Depression. Talk about, please, about the creation of the Negro units under the FTP.
Well, the Negro units were kind of an outgrowth of the Black Renaissance, which here locally came out of the Bronzeville neighborhood in the South Side. Um, Theodore Ward, who was the playwright who wrote Big White Fog, wrote it with the encouragement of more established writers like Richard Wright and other members of the local writers club. It was produced under the auspices of the Federal Theatre Project, and really can serve as a microcosm of the conflict that was taking place nationwide, as everyone from works progress administrators, local audiences, actors, and members of Congress struggled to understand the identity of their nation and its arts. As we were discussing, by the 1930s, commercial theater had largely defined and confined Blacks to a certain cultural roles, namely, the bumbling comics, primitive caricatures, with notable exceptions. One of those was Langston Hughes. Black playwrights were largely, as I mentioned earlier, their works, apart from Mr. Hughes, were relegated to, amateur productions or college productions. And at the same time that white people were being so presumptuous as to say they knew, the Black man better than the Black man knew himself, Black intellectuals were engaged in defining and redefining the Black identity. So it was kind of a push and pull going on. Art is not composed of sort of like a single idea or a single idea. It is
Sure. Right.
It is the result of many ideas all going on at the same time. So art does not occur in a vacuum. And it's certainly the case of the Big White Fog.
So there are 23 Negro units established under the Federal Theatre Project. And we should also mention there's, the Federal Writers Project, there's the Federal Ballet Project. The enormous amount of money and effort is put into it, with the underlying belief that the arts are worthy of funding, that art is a labor, and that as one documentary I saw said, nobody expected these shows to turn a profit, and they didn't have to. They were offered many times for free because the art in itself was worthy. It was worth something to the federal government, and the FTP and other programs, correlative programs, say this. But to find complexity, we didn't. These are some shots from FTP Productions and Behind Stage. We're not used to seeing two African American people or one in a complex, dimensionalized drama, assuming complex characters. And FTP says, no, we'll have some of that, actually.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Well, there was, even at the time of the when the Big White Fog was produced, people were concerned because the Big White Fog, it described, the production was described as being relentless in the way it uncovered the possibility of the Black working class to fashion itself into one middle class type or another. But there was another element, and that was the element of communism.
Mm-hmm.
Any collaboration between whites and Blacks at the time was viewed by most as communist activity, including the NAACP.
Mm-hmm.
They were afraid, as were many, that this would result in, the production would result in firing up conflict between races. There would be riots and all kinds of terrible things would come. There would be strikes and boycotts. As it turns out, when the play opened, all of their fears were completely allayed.
Mm-hmm.
White people actually saw this production, those who did, And they began to identify, because they hadn't been exposed to this aspect of Black life in America.
Hmm.
And those who came, and actually came to sympathize and identify in some ways, because they said, well, these are just working people. And I think that's the strength of Ward's script.
Hmm.
For those who aren't familiar with it, the plot of Big White Fog centers around the character of Victor Mason, who was played by Canada Lee. And it tells the story of the lack of opportunities for Blacks in America. Mason, who was discouraged by the inequality, joins the ranks of Marcus Garvey, who was a very influential Black leader and proposed such ideas as moving Black people to a country of their own, they could call their own, in South America. However, at the time the play is set, the stock market crash happens, and subsequently causing obviously the collapse of the economy and kind of the hopes and dreams of his family. The family suffers a downhill slide and is facing eviction. However, at the last minute, Mason's son enlists the help of some white friends and gathers a group of sympathetic people who prevent the family from being evicted. Unfortunately, during the struggle, Mason is shot and killed. As I mentioned, there was a divided response about the production from both Blacks and whites. I mentioned that the NAACP saw elements of communism going on there, and they had always kind of approached the W.D. Bois gradualist approach to civil rights. That was what they had sort of locked themselves into, and they weren't real comfortable with this, with the scenes that were portrayed in the play because of that gradualist policy. And even Shirley Graham, who initially had been a supporter of the play, changed her mind about the viability of the play's production. In a letter to Harry Minturn, she says, this play does tear open old sores and leave them uncovered and bleeding. I fear that it's a production that at the time will do immeasurable harm to the very people it's attempting to help. Excuse me.
That's okay. It's funny because it's not funny, but if you were to look up Theodore Ward now, and so of course Wikipedia, there's a biography, and the first thing is he's listed as a leftist playwright. Because we've got to put adjectives in there, especially if it's someone from a minority group, a woman. And so while the 4 years that the FTP is running and producing both original works like Big White Fog, and also, we should mention, we were talking before we went on about Voodoo Macbeth, that FTP, not only Hallie Flanagan, who headed the Federal Theatre, did enjoy different, weird, and relentless theater, but they also produced a lot of standards. And so there were people that got to see, Shaw and Shakespeare, and and again, free or very low cost. And this was also in the Negrion. It's not only Theodore Ward's play Big White Fog, but Lysistrata and Macbeth and Undercleave and the Lion. The units are producing work. and work for public consumption. And they're giving a platform, a place for playwrights, African American, Caucasian, whatever, to be produced.
Yes, and then there was the children's productions that they put on.
Right.
Um, so yeah, I mean, it covered the gamut. We're talking about Big White Fog now, which was sort of a a, a social drama or a problem play, um, using the vernacular of the time. But in terms of offerings, they were very smart in terms for offering a variety of productions, everything from, as you mentioned, Orson Welles' Voodoo Macbeth, which was, you know, put a whole new take on the Macbeth tale.
And it was enormously popular.
It was huge. It
Yeah.
was huge. And this was before Citizen Kane. This was while he was still,
Oh,
doing
he was 20 years old. Yeah.
yes, this was still when he was playing the Shadow on radio. He would the stories. He didn't have time because he was like in the middle of rehearsal, so he would like grab a cab, run to the studio, and they would throw the script in front of him. And because he was that good, the music would start, and he would just launch into the show. And many of his fellow company members, like Agnes Moorehead, were also appeared on The Shadow. But yeah, that was it. That you could make an argument say that the Federal Theatre Project really helped launch the career of Orson Welles.
John Houseman and Orson Welles, the New York Negro unit, right? They're the head. They had it.
Oh, yeah.
And then they do pass it on after a year. The John Houseman, right? They do pass it on after a year to 3 African American directors.
Right.
To me, it's so inconceivable to imagine. This is almost 80 years ago, 80 some years ago, that this is getting funded and getting space, and of course, because it is so unimaginable, it lasts 4 years. You mentioned Shirley Graham, just for context, and you mentioned the children's plays. So Shirley Graham Dubois was an author and an activist, and also, like Garvey, interested in a post-colonial world, and that might have meant leaving a racist, racism in America. So she would, for her to have come out and criticized Big White Fog, this is her writing. She did a children's show based on the Little Black Sambo book. She wanted to present a more complex, Little Black Sambo. I mean, it's still published. But she wanted to offer something about that book from an African American perspective. So for her to have come out and criticized Big White Fog, I'm sure that hurt. I'm sure that hurt, Ward.
Oh, yes. Most definitely.
But we know that, as you said, there were no riots. There was no destruction of public property. The show runs how many performances?
37.
Yeah. And I think it's mixed, but there's a lot of positive. As you say, some of the responses, people were, perhaps Caucasian, were really not say happy, but it's like, well, I got to look at something that I don't normally get to see.
Right, and I think that was, that's a tip of the hat to Ward's script, where it isn't a Black family that relies on the help of its white neighbor. It's the community, the communal aspect of it. It's not just one white man or one white neighbor who helps out the Mason family. It's sympathetic community members. And I think that's probably the strength of the script. Uh, it's the one that, if people were sort of reticent about the play's message, that would have been the moment when they said, "Oh, I see," to coin a phrase, "it takes a village." And that's as true today as it was back then. Any given people's problems can't be solved necessarily within the community. That community can come up with an idea, a plan, but eventually they'll need to reach out to some people and establish a coalition. So it's a strength of the coalition. Between varying groups that ultimately help advance a people and society as a whole.
So you mentioned about censorship, and I'll just say that we're talking with Pete Blatchford, the author of Wicked, Immoral, Utterly Bad, Illustrated History of Chicago Theater, and we're focused today on the production of Theodore Ward's play Big White Fog, which premiered February 17th, 1938, in Chicago. And the Great Northern Theater.
That's right.
Where's that located? On Randolph?
I think so.
Yeah, in the Loop.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. It is in the Loop. I'm not sure exactly where it's. Probably not far from. Since the Great Northern was a major railroad line, it was not far from Union Station.
It's a problem play, written by an African American playwright that has an interracial cast.
Yes.
And not, white characters with black servants. Interracial as in complex African American and Caucasian actors in a complex plot.
And not a white Superman coming down to save the day.
Right. Right.
I think that's the audacity of the piece.
What do we know about what happened? So after 39, the FTP it is no more. Its funding is gone. We're about to enter, getting close to entering World War II.
Yeah.
The Depression is kind of winding down.
Yeah.
What do we know about what happens? The play runs for 37 performances. Ward writes prolifically. Many, many works are produced in those 4 years. And then it all just kind of goes away.
Well, I think that is largely due to gearing up for the war. The country's priorities changed just like that. And it was also 1938, the time when the committee for the House on Un-American Activities Committee was established. And if it had not been the war, then that committee, along with Republicans in Congress, would have made the Federal Theatre Project a focus of investigations. You could make that argument. We won't, we don't know that for sure. So in a way, the war kind of helped preserve the Federal Theatre Project and the federal arts programs in general from having, mud thrown in their general direction, or any sort of scandal conceived by the committee or by conservatives who, from the very outset, were opposed to this program. They were opposed to largely any works progress, but it was the Works Progress Administration was one way, and a very effective way, to put people back to work and thereby start putting money back into the economy, because you pay people to do work. A person, the best welfare check, or the best relief check, or the best relief program for a person is a job. So whether it's putting a shovel in someone's hand so they can clear roads, or whether it's allowing them to make great art on stage, or do writing, or create a dance, you're paying them money. That money is taxed. It goes back to the people. And on top of all that, where the arts program was concerned, because of the affordability of the most productions, some of them, as you mentioned, were free, the American people benefit. They didn't have money to go to the theater, so they would, they could dress up and they could go downtown and they could see, a Shakespeare show or a play by Shaw, or maybe if they were so bold, maybe see one of the more experimental programs, a living newspaper or what have you, and they could see it for free or for just a few dollars, or maybe $1. And for a few hours, they could forget their troubles. And what greater gift could you ask for? It, much like the plot of Big White Fog, you've got people helping people, and we're all in this together.
Right.
Like so many of the Works Progress Administration programs.
Well, looking at pictures of Hallie Flanagan, the head of the Federal Theatre Project, here she's testifying in the second shot before the House Committee on Un-American Activities, which was tracking in the 30s, absolutely.
Yes, it was.
Because communism was getting a foothold, and people were saying, well, this, I don't have money, I don't have a house, I don't, this doesn't seem to be working. What was Hoover's slogan? A chicken in every pot, right? A car in every
Right, exactly.
One working for everyone. So she, we look at some of the productions, and there's one in Yiddish, right? There's a Yiddish unit.
Yes, there is.
Federal Theatre Project.
Yes, there is.
They were resurrecting like Carmen, right? And Shaw, and they were also producing works like Native Ground, One Third of a Nation, on issues. It Can't Happen Here, on dictatorship, and on, as we were talking about, syphilis. The Federal Theatre Project had a very wide and impressive reach. The Negro units were bold and needed, and you want to believe, even if it only lasted 4 years, that some of it at least opened the door to possibility.
Yes, and it was not without critics, even within even within the Federal Theatre Project itself. One of Chicago's most successful productions was a parody, a send-up of the Federal Theatre Project called "Oh Say Can You Sing," which poked fun at the bureaucracy. And another production from Chicago that went on to huge success in New York was a rechristened Swing Mikado called Oh dear. Can we edit that part out?
You're talking about the Gilbert and Sullivan Mikado,
Right.
um, and the African American version of it was called Swing Mikado. I do have some shots of that. I'll pull up. So they were.
I know what it was. Michael Todd, future husband of Elizabeth Taylor, producer from Chicago, took Swing Mikado, rechristened it Hot Mikado, and took it to New York for a successful run.
Right. And as you say, but so there's some shots of Swing Mikado. Just a different take on the Gilbert and Sullivan piece. And there's a shot of Bronzeville having its own renaissance like Harlem, producing amazing African in a milieu for African American community and artists in the 30s. You mentioned Muddy Waters, Mahalia Jackson, Gwendolyn Brooks, the poet Gwendolyn Brooks.
Right.
So, but it's a strange time, but to return to Ward's play.
Yes.
I will end with that, and just again to mention, I'm talking with Pete Blatchford. The book is Wicked, Immoral, Utterly Bad. It's a really very fine book, and it's not only I say that because I love working with Pete, and a good guy and an intelligent writer and thinker, but the history of Chicago theater, it touches so many aspects of the history of theater. And so we've talked about the Iroquois Fire. We've talked about improv. We have not done a deep dive about Jane Addams, but there are so many parts of Chicago theater that you think, oh my goodness, there's this lateral tangential effect that begins in Chicago. Big White Fog is produced on this day in 1938. Ward goes on to write for a while, although, it takes a long time for Big White Fog to be produced again.
Yes.
The Guthrie in Minneapolis did it a couple years ago. It had a London revival. It gets discovered every now and then. But Ward, like you say, the war happens and FTP, and it becomes a chapter in American history. The most positive, I don't know if it's the most positive, but Langston Hughes had something very powerful to say about.
Yes.
And Langston Hughes was a poet and a playwright himself. About Ward's play, and I guess we'll stop with that. But he says it's the greatest, most encompassing play on Negro life that has ever been written. And then he tells them if it isn't liked by people, it's because they're not ready. They're not ready for it, not because it's not a great play.
And in the Big White Fog, like any show, in a musical, you want people to go out humming one of the songs. In a social drama, a problem play, so-called, you want people to go out thinking. And this certainly gave people things to think about. Ward's message ultimately is a hopeful one. It is one that shows what can be done if we all work together as a society. And that's a message that resonates with all audiences. And I think you could make the argument that that is the reason that there weren't riots, that there weren't people out picketing the production. And it was the soothing balm that covered well, as Graham said, she said that the wounds were not uncovered, but I would argue that they would help to cover the wound, or protect the wound, perhaps might be a better way of saying it.
Or provide the vaccination. So in 1938 and in 2022, we have to work together.
Yes, and I'm coming from this from a 2022, perspective, not a 1938 perspective. So I don't know what that mindset was all about. But I do recognize the NAACP's conservative means to achieve civil rights for Black people in this country. There was controversy, Booker T. Washington had his approach, W.D. Du Bois had his approach, and that's kind of the one that they adopted. So for better or for worse. And it would be years, Martin Luther King was just a boy when this was going on. So it would be years. Little side note, you mentioned Hull House and improvisation. The children's games, that improvisation as we know it, that came out of Hull House, were funded in part by the Federal Theatre Project and the Works Progress Administration. So it all comes full circle.
Very good. Thank you for joining us, everyone. We've been talking to Pete Blatchford, author of Wicked and Moral, Utterly Bad, Illustrated History of Chicago Theater. Great text, great images. It's a wonderful book for anyone who loves Chicago history, theater history, wants to know how it all comes full circle. And thank you, Pete, for coming to me about the topic of a play that I didn't know about.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. It allowed me to introduce other information not in the book. So I appreciate that very much.
If you all have any comments, feel free to contact me or Pete on Facebook, or go to wickedchicagostage.com. I'm sure we'll be focusing on something else in the future. Hope this has been interesting, and I hope you go out and investigate Big White Fog and Federal Theatre Project and see what you can find out. And if you see a production coming up somewhere, maybe you'll want to buy a ticket and go. So good night, everyone. Thanks for stopping by, and I'll talk to you soon.
Take care.